Did you know that every time you're online, your data is just kind of out there, floating around? It's kind of a little bit worrying, isn't it? What if you logged into your bank and there's someone sniffing that? They're like, what do I smell? Money, that's what I smell, your money coming to me. And Surfshark, well, they're a VPN that make it easy for you to protect yourself. One subscription to Surfshark covers unlimited devices. That can be your phone, your laptop, your whole household, whatever. It makes it all extremely affordable. I don't know, everyone's got 1,000 devices these days, and covering all of them with one subscription is great. And you get over 3,200 servers in 100 plus countries, giving you access to content from anywhere without any problems. Plus, you can also get better deals on flights and hotels. And the best part, there's a 30-day money-back guarantee, so you can actually try it risk-free, and if you don't like it, you get your money back. But you will like it. It's Surfshark. They're the best. Click the link in the description below or go to surfshark.com/ITS and use the code ITS at checkout to get 4 extra months of Surfshark VPN. And now today's episode. If you look at the x-ray in the emergency room, it would look fine. Clear lungs, clean bones, no shrapnel anywhere. The blast victim, they'd get stitched up, they'd get sent home, case closed. But a few days later, they'd probably come back because something ain't right. This time, the ultrasound, it's telling a different story. The tissue is peppered with tiny little splinters embedded deep, dozens of them. Now, the x-ray couldn't see them because they weren't metal, they were plastic. And this happens a lot more than you'd think. Now, x-rays are brilliant at finding metal, glass, even gravel, but wood, plastic, certain composites, they are essentially useless at finding them. High-frequency ultrasound does catch what x-rays miss, and sometimes you might even need an MRI or a CT scan. But that first-line imaging, the x-ray, the one that most emergency rooms rely on, it has a blind spot for plastic. When a surgeon can't see what's buried in someone's tissue, they can't remove it. What should have been a straightforward trauma case becomes a medical mystery. And then, rather quickly, a medical crisis. Now, if simple material swap can hide fragments from first-line imaging, what else does it hide? From airport body scanners, from bomb disposal units searching for IEDs, all sorts of stuff. In 1980, the world's militaries sat down in Geneva and agreed on something remarkable. Certain weapons were simply too cruel to use. Among them were weapons designed to maim people with fragments that X-rays can't detect. They called them non-detectable fragments, and Protocol 1 of the Convention on Conventional Weapons banned them outright. Today, it's recognized as customary international humanitarian law, Rule 79, binding even countries that never signed the treaty. And wouldn't it be nice if it just worked like that? The logic is brutally simple. When a surgeon can't see shrapnel on an X-ray, they face an impossible choice. Dig blindly through tissue, hoping to find invisible fragments, or leave them in and risk infection, migration, and chronic pain. But here's the critical detail that most people miss. The ban is effect-based. It prohibits weapons whose primary effect is to injure using invisible fragments. A plastic casing on a grenade, that's fine. A mine with composite components could also be fine. But a weapon specifically engineered to do this, that's a no-go. And the distinction really does matter because modern weapons use non-metallic materials everywhere for weight reduction, cost savings, weather resistance. The law doesn't ban the materials, it bans the deliberate weaponization of medical invisibility. So, fantastic, the world agreed to outlaw them. Case closed, right? Thanks for being here. Well, no, look, you're not in that fantasy world. You're here on planet Earth because, no, and no, this ain't close to closed. So after World War II, the plastics revolution transformed everything, including weapons. Suddenly, munitions designers had access to materials that were lighter than steel, cheaper than brass, and completely immune to rust. Amazing! Good news, everybody! The military advantages were obvious. Plastic components meant soldiers could carry more ammunition. Weapons could survive decades in humid jungles or scorching deserts without corroding. Manufacturing costs absolutely plummeted. But there was another advantage, one that would haunt battlefields for generations. Plastic doesn't set off metal detectors. By the Cold War, minimum metal and plastic-cased mines had become a deminer's worst nightmare. In soil already cluttered with shell fragments and scrap metal, finding a mine with almost no metallic signature was like searching for a specific grain of sand on a beach. What used to take hours now took days. And the same went for medics treating blast victims. The materials revolution that made weapons cheaper and lighter also made them harder to find in minefields and also in human bodies. But the unintended consequences were just beginning. Take the M14 anti-personnel mine, the lovely named toe popper. Deployed by the millions starting in the 1950s, it was about the size of a hockey puck and almost entirely plastic. Deminers discovered the hard way that their detectors simply couldn't find them. In Vietnam, in Cambodia, across Southeast Asia, these invisible killers waited in the soil. Even when you knew they were there, even when you had the exact minefield maps, finding them was a massive job. Every sweep of the metal detector turned up nothing, or worse, it turned up everything except the mine. Bullet casings, shrapnel, nails, each piece of scrap metal had to be investigated, excavated, and removed. Meanwhile, the actual mine just sat there, silent and undetectable, just centimeters away, waiting to blow. Now, under international pressure and facing the reality of their own troops needing to clear these mines, the US military made a modification. They added a simple steel washer, just a thin ring of metal, a few grams. That tiny addition transformed the M14 from invisible to detectable. One small metal washer meant the difference between a minefield that takes months to clear and one that takes weeks. It also made it way more safe for the people tasked with removing the mines. Okay, so let's go back to our emergency room example, the imaging problem that's surprisingly specific. I mean, like we said, X-rays, they're great at finding metal, glass, and gravel. These materials block X-rays, showing up as bright white shapes against darker tissue. But wood, plastic, and organic matter? Not so much. When doctors suspect radiolucent foreign bodies, which is fancy medical speak for things the X-ray can't see, they reach for high-frequency ultrasound. The sound waves bounce off materials differently than X-rays do, revealing plastic splinters and wood fragments hiding in tissue. For deeper or more complex cases, CT scans or MRIs can help. But that first ultrasound sweep is often the difference between catching an infection early and watching it spread for weeks, while everyone wonders what's wrong. But now let's step away from just fragments, because the security problem is bigger than just mines. So, you know when you go to the airport or some important building and you walk through a metal detector? Well, they do exactly what the name says. They detect metal. They don't detect anything else. A plastic explosive, a ceramic blade, a composite weapon component. Those can go straight through. And that's why modern airports don't rely on metal detectors alone. Those grey tunnel scanners you step into use millimeter wave technology to see shapes and densities, not just metal. The carry-on bag scanners use CT technology now, basically 3D imaging that can spot plastic explosives by their density signatures, even when they're shaped like everyday objects. The US government saw this problem coming decades ago. The Undetectable Firearms Act, passed in 1988 and renewed multiple times since, makes it illegal to manufacture, import, or possess firearms that don't contain enough metal to trigger standard detectors and show up clearly on X-ray machines. The ATF enforces this strictly. Any firearm must have at least 3.7 ounces of steel in its construction. It's another attempt to close the same loophole that we've been talking about. Force manufacturers to include enough metal that their products can't slip past basic security. If it sounds familiar, that's because it's the M14 toe-popping mine that we saw earlier, all over again. But here's the thing about security. It's always just a game of catch-up. The screening technology gets better, the threat materials evolve, the detection systems advance again, and round it goes. While the airports have million-dollar scanners and trained operators, the local courthouse still's got a metal detector from 1995, doesn't it? The stadium has that wand that mostly only finds ferrous metals. Most security checkpoints, they're still fighting yesterday's threats. Now let's get out of the civilian sector and go back to war, shall we? Now, after any blast, every fragment tells a story, and forensic investigators know that. Post-blast investigations increasingly rely on materials analysis of embedded fragments, and not just the metal ones, but plastic, composite, just about everything. Each piece carries a chemical fingerprint that can reveal where it was made, what batch it came from, sometimes even which factory produced it. The protocols developed from US military cases are remarkably thorough. Microscopy reveals manufacturing marks invisible to the naked eye. Mass spectrometry identifies polymer types and additives. Compositional analysis can match fragments to specific production runs. But here's the catch. You've got to recover those samples first. When fragments are invisible on X-rays, when they don't trigger metal detectors, when surgeons can't find them, they often just stay buried in tissue. The evidence remains locked inside victims' bodies. Sometimes the most valuable forensic evidence is the hardest to detect, and that's not an accident. The fragment that can't be found can't be traced. The weapon that leaves no signature leaves no trail. As we mentioned a little bit ago, international law does ban weapons primarily designed to injure with undetectable fragments, and that word primarily does a lot of the work there, because harm still happens through perfectly legal designs, and that's a shocker, I'm sure. Secondary fragmentation is everywhere in modern warfare. A plastic drone casing shatters on impact. Wood and concrete become projectiles. Composite materials from vehicles turn into shrapnel. None of these were designed as weapons, but they kill and maim just the same and they're invisible on X-rays. Improvised explosive devices present another problem. When someone packs explosives into a plastic container filled with glass or marbles or ceramic bearings, they're not trying to evade Protocol 1. They're using whatever materials they can find. But the medical consequence is identical. Then there are the minimum metal mines still buried from conflicts that ended decades ago. And there's millions of them out there from wars fought before the treaties were signed. They're not illegal retroactively, they're just there, waiting. Invisible. And this grey zone is where most of the suffering actually happens, not from weapons deliberately engineered to produce undetectable fragments, but from the vast universe of designs that achieve the same effect through other means. The legal distinction matters in Geneva, but a surgeon still has the same problem. A fragment that can't be seen on an X-ray causes the same medical complications whether it violated international law or not. The suffering is the same regardless of intent. Now, the Ukraine war has changed everything we thought we know about weapons manufacturing. Both sides are 3D printing munitions at unprecedented scale. Plastic casings for drone-dropped bombs, polymer tail fins, composite housings for grenades, all sorts of... The driving force isn't invisibility here, it's production speed. When you need thousands of drone munitions per day, waiting for metal casings just isn't an option. A 3D printer can run 24 hours straight, turning spools of plastic filament into weapon components, no foundry required. But the material choice has consequences beyond manufacturing efficiency. These plastic case munitions produce different fragmentation patterns than their metal predecessors. The casings shatter into smaller, lighter pieces that penetrate less deeply but spread more widely. And yes, they're much harder to detect with standard equipment. Defense analysts documenting the shift note something troubling. As polymer substitution becomes normalized, it's expanding beyond casings to actual munition bodies and stabilizer fins. Components that were always metal are now being printed in reinforced plastics. The medical implications are already emerging. Field hospitals report increased cases of blast injuries with no visible fragments on X-rays. Surgeons describe wounds contaminated with polymer shards that only show up on ultrasound, if at all. The democratization of weapons manufacturing through 3D printing has inadvertently created a new generation of munitions that share one characteristic with banned weapons. Their fragments are increasingly invisible to the medical imaging most field hospitals rely on. The technology is racing ahead. The medical response is struggling to keep up. So zoom out from the operating room and the scale becomes staggering. While surgeons wrestle with invisible splinters in one patient, deminers are inching across entire provinces contaminated with low detectable mines. Their cumulative effect is measured in time, years, sometimes decades, lost harvests because fields can't be cleared, closed roads that cut off entire villages from markets and schools, families displaced for generations, waiting to return to lands that might be safe, but no one can guarantee it. The Halo Trust documents this grinding reality. In Cambodia alone, they've been clearing the same minefields for 30 years. Some areas require multiple passes with different detection technologies just to achieve minimum safety standards. The Lands Mine Monitor tracks over 60 countries, still contaminated from conflicts that ended before most people alive today were even born. Non-detectability doesn't just make clearance harder, it makes it way more expensive. A metal mine that takes an hour to locate and remove might cost a few $100s to clear. A minimum metal mine in the same soil could take days and cost 1,000. Multiply that by millions of mines and you understand why some countries will never be fully cleared. Now, the detection community isn't standing still. Dual sensor technology, combining traditional metal detection with ground-penetrating radar, can find mines that either system alone would miss. New algorithmic filtering helps separate actual threats from the endless false positives. Some experimental systems use neutron bombardment or chemical sniffers to detect explosives directly, regardless of casing material. Hospitals are updating their protocols too. Suspected radiolucent foreign body, ultrasound first, always, then a CT or MRI if needed. Some trauma centers now keep ultrasound machines in every emergency bay just for this purpose. But of course, it's a cat and mouse game. As detection improves, materials evolve. Modern polymers can be engineered with specific densities, acoustic properties, even magnetic signatures. 3D printing allows for complex internal structures that confuse imaging systems. Carbon fiber composites can be tuned to match surrounding materials almost perfectly. And the new frontier is already emergent. What happens when fragments are designed to match soft tissue density, when they have the same acoustic impedance as muscle, the same X-ray absorption as fat? Scary stuff. The detection technology is advancing, but so is concealment. Shall we speculate a little bit? I mean, material science is advancing rapidly. Commodity plastics are giving way to engineered composites with precisely tuned properties. We're already seeing foams and polymers designed to match specific densities. But here's something that isn't going to change. Protocols 1, Prohibition, remains stable international law. The technology arms race isn't happening in the banned zone of deliberately undetectable weapons. It's happening in all the spaces that law doesn't cover, the grey zones where innovation and threat evolution outpace regulation, and there are a lot of wars like that these days. War isn't neat. So as we finish today, let's return to that emergency room patient from the beginning. The one with the clean x-ray who came back days later with spreading infection. The second ultrasound found what the first x-ray missed: dozens of plastic fragments embedded throughout the tissue. Surgery removed most of them. Antibiotics fought the infection. The patient recovered. They were lucky. But think about what that one material substitution, metal to plastic, actually cost. Extra days in the hospital, a second surgery, risk of sepsis, all because the fragments couldn't be seen with standard imaging. Now multiply that by thousands of casualties, and the D-miners spending months to clear fields that should take weeks. International law tried to prevent this. Protocol 1 banned weapons designed to injure with undetectable fragments. The mine treaties forced manufacturers to add metal back into their designs. These were good attempts to close a dangerous loophole, but the problem has evolved beyond what those laws anticipated. Whether through deliberate design, cost-cutting improvisation, or decades-old legacy contamination, we live in a world increasingly full of fragments that basic detectors cannot find. And the people who pay the highest price? They're the civilians in former conflict zones, still dealing with invisible threats decades after the fighting stopped, because long after the headlines fade, those fragments remain, and that's the true cost of making weapons harder to find, not just in the moment of impact, but in all the moments that follow, for generations. One simple change was all it took. Thank you for watching.